I should be happy, elated, really. The world finally got with the program. We've done better. The silence is no longer deafening. Inclusivity, diversity, equity. I've always thought these values to be important. And now, praise be, society has seen the light. If you look at media and advertising media lately, it's like every single brand has turned into a United Colors of Benetton ad from the 90s. I was recently watching the movie Downsizing. There's this climactic scene where Matt Damon is tripping balls on LSD at a penthouse party. Right when he's about to peak, the sickest deep house track starts playing and the place turns into like a kaleidoscope-infused after-hours club where everyone just dances the night away. If mass media will convince you of anything, it's that Western civilization is in that moment. One big hedonistic, inclusive pride parade. Look at me. Look at what I used to look like. Obviously, I don't think inclusivity to be a scam, but I do smell the bullshit. What's the theory? If you're exposed to something potentially false often enough, you may start to believe it to be true. I'm concerned we may be buying into our own hype. Inclusivity is a great idea, but if there's anything you'll learn as a creative, it's that ideas aren't worth much. It's the execution that's shmoney. But for the execution of a great idea to work, someone needs to pitch it and another party needs to buy it. In society's case, buy into it. I'm not convinced society has bought into the idea of inclusivity as much as we may be deluding ourselves into thinking it has. And by that, I mean,
I'm starting to think that as a result of repeated exposure to messaging and imaging that happens to, at the moment, support our perception of the world, that we may now be accepting this front-end perception of the world as some kind of widely accepted truth/reality, when it is not at all indicative of what is really going on and how people really feel in the back end, on the streets, the full picture, the whole pie.
In other words, we downloaded a great new Apple update called Inclusivity 2.0, but the hardware is still rotten and the thing is bound to crash. And guess what? You won't have saved the latest draft of your project. Basically, we may be scamming our selves. Let's begin. But first, my Jeopardy moment, the Inclusivity Starter Pack. What is inclusivity? Inclusivity is the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those having physical or mental disabilities or belonging to minority groups. Expanding on this, dictionary.com mentions inclusivity as the fact or policy of not excluding members or participants on the grounds of gender, race, class, sexuality, or disability. What is the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusivity? According to a blog post I found, diversity is the presence of difference within a given setting, diversity of identities like race and gender identity, and in some cases, ethnicity, religion, nationality, or sexual orientation. Equity. According to that same blog post, equity is an approach that ensures everyone has access to the same opportunities. Equity recognizes that advantages and barriers exist, and that as a result, we don't all start from the same place. Equity is a process that begins by acknowledging that unequal starting place and makes a commitment to correct and address the imbalance. Tangibly, this means ensuring that nobody has any unfair advantages. Inclusion. Inclusion is about people with different identities feeling and/or being valued, leveraged, and welcomed within a given setting. Diversity is being asked to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. I have to say though, sometimes less is more. In this video, I will refer to inclusivity as a catch-all umbrella term that embodies all of the above. How does inclusivity generally manifest itself practically in business, commerce, and the marketplace. I'll give you a few examples. In advertising, inclusivity has meant that we now have individuals of different gender identities, races, sexuality, body types, religion, and more represented and included. At a product level, inclusivity tries to offer solutions for everyone. In the makeup industry, for instance, this often means having shades for all skin tones. In the fashion business, this often means expanding sizes beyond a cookie cutter X small, small, medium, large, X large. If you're in the restaurant business, this means having options for people with different dietary restrictions/preferences, being wheelchair accessible, and not just hiring hot people. A miracle. A miracle. At a supplier level, it means working with smaller, lesser-known brands and going out of your way to find and support suppliers that come from otherwise overlooked communities. At a workplace or corporate level, inclusivity means having that representation present at every level of the hierarchy. It means putting into place systems that make sure otherwise overlooked or marginalized individuals have a voice, are treated equally, and whatever barriers they may have to their advancement are out of the way. At the most basic level, it's don't discriminate, don't show preferential treatment, don't show or at least act on bias, and don't be a dick. Hire, promote, involve, compensate, and congratulate people accordingly off of merit, which the merit part is part of the debate against inclusivity. But that's probably another video for another day. How did inclusivity become the flavor of the day? Well, to put it bluntly, pressure and lawsuits. I'm kidding. It's more layered than that. We have demographic change, cultural change, good business, and lawsuits. Demographics. The DNA of our world is changing. Much to the English aristocracy's dismay, most people are no longer what you would consider purebred. In America, for example, in the past decade, and for the first time in history, the white population has declined, and people who identify as multiracial, Hispanic, and Asian are driving most of the population growth, which means that in the future, non-whites are likely to become the majority. More people are not white today than they were not white before. Culture. Culture alone is super layered. So, in the most reductive way possible, one of the ideas is that changing demographics is paving the way to cultural change. The people want a corporate world and market that reflects and includes them. Culturally, we've also seen the rise, reemergence, and reinvigoration of social movements that, coupled with the rise of social media, have shined light on systemic injustice and discrimination. As well, certain realities that have always existed, such as being gay, are no longer as stigmatized as they used to. As mentioned in a report by Pew Research, on certain political issues, notably homosexuality, America in particular has moved a little bit more to the left. The left has made some gains. Finally, culturally, we are also now expecting much more out of our brands than simply pushing product. When it comes to Gen Z, for example, 94% of that generation expects companies to take a stand on important social issues, and 90% say they are more willing to purchase products that they deem beneficial to society. Business. Increasingly, there seems to be data to back up the fact that the practice of inclusivity may be a good business move. First of all, because it's noticed. Second of all, it seems to have an impact on brand awareness. Third of all, it helps with brand loyalty. Fourth, it has an impact on brand growth. 5, and finally, it seems to keep brands competitive. And the last layer of this already very layered onion, and my favorite, lawsuits. To put it as bluntly as Harvard Business Review did, and I quote, businesses started caring a lot more about diversity after a series of high-profile lawsuits rocked the financial industry. As we'll see later in the Abercrombie Fitch section of this video, lawsuits weren't isolated to the financial industry. It's one thing to come for someone's reputation. It's a whole other thing when you come for their coin. And when you do come for their coin, you tend to get mandatory diversity and equity programs so people can cover their ass. The illusion of consensus. It truly emotes me to assert this, but the world is changing. Not only is it changing, but we are now seeing the rise of an influential, market-leading, future-shaping entity This entity is what McKinsey & Company dubs #the inclusive consumer. To distribute their survey's findings on the rise and influence of this inclusive consumer, the company crafted a spectacular opening paragraph in this little write-up they made on their website. Quote, "The American consumer is undeniably becoming more inclusive. Responding to our survey in October 2021, 2 out of 3 Americans told us their social values now shape their shopping choices, and 45%, likely representing a whopping," I added that part, 100 million shoppers believe retailers should actively support Black-owned businesses and brands. This 45% represents the inclusive consumer. #the future is inclusive. I added that part too. Wow, what a way to spin it. Oh my God, 45%. What a turnout. It's a resounding success. The inclusive consumer is here, and he, she, they are here to stay. What now? 45%? That's it? So what you're telling me is that when presented with the statement, quote, "I believe retailers should actively support Black-owned businesses and brands," 65% of the people you surveyed were like, highly disagree. Yeah, highly disagree. Not really my aesthetic, you know? So if that 45% is our splashy, earth-shattering, game-changing, inclusive consumer, how do you suggest we brand that other 65%? Oh, I know. The majority. The inclusive agnostic, inclusive skeptical, or straight up inclusive rejecting majority. A majority that if we continue to avoid, swipe under the rug, Italian style, may cost us a truly inclusive future. Listen, I don't mean to be negative. Focusing on the positive is an important coping mechanism when it comes to just dealing. However, it's one thing to be living in what Pew Research refers to as a ideological ILO. It's another thing entirely to be living in a literal alternate universe. Focusing on the positive should not come at the cost of collectively deluding ourselves from reality. The reality. To emphasize my point, I cherry-picked a healthy dose of dark and depressing reality just for you. How about we start with the fact that there seems to be more hate groups today than there was 20 years ago. If we take a gander at this handy little hate map put together by the SPL Center, in the past 20 years, it seems like hate groups have risen from 599 to 733. Allow me to now draw your attention to the menu bar, where you can filter the hate map by ideology. Would you like a taste of the anti-immigrant Merlot circa 2019? Or perhaps you'd prefer the anti-LGBTQ Sangiovese circa Orlando 2016. Oh, I know. How about the general hate Zinfandel circa the beginning of f***ing time? Or how about the fact that 8 in 10 Asian Americans today say violence against them is rising, and nearly half experienced an incident tied to their racial or ethnic background since the pandemic began? Next, the United Nations released a report that cheekily mentioned, almost in passing, that, quote, there is plenty of bias against women, and it's not unconscious at all. In other words, people know what they're doing. People can also just be quote, worldwide, 25% of people think that a university education is more important for a man than for a woman. And in the US, 6.5% still believe education is more important for men, end quote. In the UK, 25% of people, representing 1/4, thought men should have more right to a job than women. I'm not done. According to another survey by Ipsos Mori, 1/5 of men and women surveyed globally say women are inferior to men or shouldn't aspire to work outside the house. And I saved the kicker for last. Worldwide, almost 30% of people think it's justifiable for a man to beat his partner. The writer took it upon herself to conclude that sentence with, "It's not." Bias is one thing. If you really want a window into the mind of the people, we should also look at political ideology. Well, people are more divided, immovable, and rigid in their political beliefs than ever. People in America are currently more consistently on the left or right than ever. And we genuinely hate the other side more than we did in the past. The animosity is so real that more people today have such a highly negative view of the other side that they quite literally think the other side is a threat to the nation's, and we can assume their, well-being. Now, this video is about inclusivity. One of the key markers of inclusivity is valuing ethnic and racial diversity. Well, according to Pew Research, only 20% of conservatives think it's important that a community have racial and ethnic diversity, and only 76% of liberals think that. That's a lot of people who haven't bought into the idea of inclusivity. Would you like to know what happens when you don't buy into the idea of inclusivity, even when it becomes trendy and the heat to conform turns up? Abercrombie Fitch. This is about to get really good. I will be saying the word allegedly all over this section. Long story, super short. Lex Wexner, the retail genius. L Brands, Victoria's Secret, Jeffrey Epstein fame. In the late 1980s, he purchased a flailing brand called Abercrombie Fitch. He hired a CEO called Mike Jeffries to reinvent, reimagine, and reinvigorate the brand. Mike Jeffries kind of looks like that scary guy who whips himself in the Da Vinci Code. But take that and bring it to the type of Beverly Hills surgeon you'd look at and think, I am never, ever letting this guy touch my face. But ignore your gut and let him touch your face. Okay. Here. Okay. Ethics aside, Mike Jeffrey killed it. According to what I understood from the Netflix documentary, he basically bet on the fact that white people wanted a brand that celebrated white people. And guess what? They did. He bet on the fact that exclusion sells. It did. He bet on a form of WASP excellence as an aspirational aesthetic. It worked. From 1996 to 1999, the company went from $165 million in sales to $1.4 billion in sales. What the Netflix documentary leads us to believe is that part of the brand's magic is that its positioning came from a place of authenticity. It wasn't just a strategic business decision. Mike Jeffries allegedly created the kind of brand he wanted to make, in line with his perception of beauty and coolness in the world. From what I understood from the Netflix documentary, all these things just happen to be white. However, the preferential aesthetic we saw at Abercrombie Fitch ended up going beyond just aesthetics and allegedly bled into the company's hiring practices. It also bled into their designs. For example, the brand had problems with racist graphic tees. We have, quote, "One more for the road, two wrongs don't make a right. Virginia, no lifeguards in that gene pool." Yeah, it was bad. But they also got sued for racial discrimination. People were alleging all kinds of crazy shits, all kinds of crazy shit. Like, if they were black, they were quite literally put into the back, into the stockroom, as opposed to in front and on the floor. They also allegedly even fired a guy and told him that they, quote, had enough Filipinos on the team, end quote. Anyways, the brand reached a settlement for $50 million. They admitted no guilt, and among many things, they agreed to change the recruiting, hiring, and marketing practices at the company. As a result, one of the things they did was create a CDO position. They made some changes, and some of the changes did work. For example, from what I understood, after the CDO was hired, it seems like there were significant changes when it comes to the ethnic diversity of the people you found on the floor. But do you know who did not change? Allegedly, Mike Jeffries. After shit hit the fan, he went on record being more immovable and rigid in his exclusionary sense of aesthetics than ever before. Years later, the company was faced with another discrimination lawsuit. This time because a girl called Samantha Elauf, sorry, Samantha, was allegedly refused a job from the company for wearing a headscarf, which conflicted with the company's dress code. They let the case go all the way up to the Supreme Court. In the company's mind, allegedly, rejecting someone on the basis of a headscarf was no different, allegedly, than rejecting someone for wearing a baseball cap, which was also, from what I understand, allegedly against the company's dress code. Samantha Elauf won her case in the Supreme Court, 8-1. Guess who did not vote in support of her cause? Allegedly, the one African-American judge. The problem: racist exist, sexist exist, homophobic exist. And just because you're now a blend of 5 different identities, like I am, doesn't mean you won't be sexist, racist, or discriminate. Just because you look different doesn't mean you think different. If we rewind to the beginning of this video, I gave you a little inclusivity starter pack. What I conveniently glossed over is the fact that more than just being an idea, inclusivity is also a belief. A belief that requires the believer to buy into a framework that accepts certain things as fact or truth. To be inclusive, you need to accept that at a fundamental level, the world is an unequal, biased, and unfair place. You need to accept that some individuals who have just as much to contribute to the world do not rise to the top because they were quite simply not given a fair shot. You need to accept the idea that some people fail to rise to the top not because they suck, but because the system sucks. In other words, there is a wider systemic failure / blind spot to include some people into the party and ask them to dance. Well, if I've learned anything so far, it's that many people, potentially a majority, don't buy into those ideas. And even when social forces, demographic change, cultural change, and lawsuits pressure someone to conform to a new politically correct standard, while on the surface one may acquiesce, behind the scenes and in the comfort of their own home, they may continue to call you the N-word. In fact, if you try to force people to change, they just become more rigid and immovable in their views. Many studies point to the fact that force feeding or pressuring people to change their beliefs can actually activate and strengthen bias. In other words, and as Harvard Business Review put it, you quite simply can't outlaw or pressure people out of bias. It's coming. Follow me here. Racism, sexism, terrorism, radical belief. If the research on the de-radicalization of terrorists can teach us anything, it's that, as the French-Canadian rapper Loud once said, these things, they take time. De-radicalization, it's a process. And this process begins with a trigger. This trigger is frequently described as a traumatic event or an emotional crisis. Alternatively, it may be a gradual realization which creates a cognitive opening. Wait a second. I thought the traumatic event or emotional crisis of having someone hold a gun to your head didn't work. I'm all confused now. Okay, so let's say the gun to your temple cancellation is the trigger. You then have a whole de-radicalization sales funnel to journey your way through. After that is pressure, public shaming, a gun to your head, enough to motivate a person to make his ideological way far enough down the tunnel to prevent Recidivism? I don't know. I'm not convinced. We should check in with this CEO, one of the few idiots that actually got caught being racist and proceeded to enroll into an anti-racism program. I'd love to know how that worked out for him. The opportunity. Now, going back to the topic of inclusivity, I've spent a lot of time grumbling about what doesn't work. So what does work in changing beliefs and ultimately making the execution of this inclusivity idea successful? According to Harvard Business Review's article, engaging with people of different beliefs works. We need to be able to see the problem from the other's perspective and engage with it actively. Here, though, I think it's also the idea that people won't engage with our ideas unless they feel like we are engaging with theirs. Contact with people who disagree with your views works. What's the saying? Familiarity breeds respect. Contact between groups reduces bias. Transparency works. We can be all up in arms about the Mike Jeffries of the world, but being transparent with your views, the decisions you make, your thought process is actually a good thing because it forces social accountability, and social accountability works. Checks and balances do also work. When you know you'll have to explain and be transparent about your decisions, thought process, and ideas to someone, people are less likely to act on bias. Mentoring programs also work. Having some formal systems in place to create those matches does help. I don't know about you, but the most important takeaway I'm getting from all this is that executing the idea of inclusivity will require and must require a degree of contact with the other. As we saw earlier, many people aren't coming into that kind of contact at home. Many people do not have the privilege of coming into that kind of contact in the workplace either. Can you think of where people do come into that kind of contact? Can you think of a place one cannot avoid bumping into the other? Oh, I know. In the market. The market is a finite place. In many cases, there are only so many options out there for a consumer. At some point, white supremacist Sally, or just that 65% that did not agree with the Black-owned business statement, will come under your roof. White supremacist Sally needs to buy makeup too. And when the only game in town may be a Walgreens or a Sephora, she may just walk into a Sephora or a Victoria's Secret if she needs underwear. To many people, walking into these supposedly inclusive places of business is the most contact they will ever have with the other in their entire eyes-low-aided lives. Brands and businesses are on the front lines when it comes to daily contact with the people. What are we doing with that contact beyond pushing products? To me, if a brand really cares about what they're preaching, they should, at least the ones who could afford to, be at the forefront of leveraging that contact to create opportunities, spaces, and moments for consumers to have that life-changing, perception-altering contact with the other. We hear a lot about experiential marketing. Brands don't want to just sell products. They want their brand to be an experience. Well, I must say, many brands really have limiting beliefs as to what constitutes an experience. I don't see them dreaming big enough. An experience isn't just aesthetic, audiovisual, or sensory. An experience is also something deeply personal, something philosophical, something political. An experience can and has the potential to also be transformative. That 65% is most likely going to walk under your tent at one point or another. And if you don't use that opportunity to activate them into discussion today, I'm afraid we may risk losing them to more extreme beliefs, more extreme parts of the internet, more extreme ideologies, and more extreme parts of society tomorrow, the future. Now you may be wondering, okay, Andarla, you have plenty of ideas, but what does this mean tangibly? At a simple level, it means that brands who seek to practice what they preach need to start leveraging their front end to build relationships and bridge gaps in society. How do we do that? I don't know. The execution will be different for everyone, but allow me to pitch a few ideas. If you also have any ideas you'd like to pitch, include them in the comments and let's brainstorm together. So maybe this means rethinking the concept or department of customer relations. Maybe this means that in the future, you don't only have a hotline where pissed off customers can call about their late or lost shipment. Maybe this means that you can also create a hotline a customer can call if they have questions about the messaging in your latest campaign, the values you're taking a stand on, or world/social issues you care about. Maybe in the future, your Sephora store doesn't only have an eyebrow bar. Maybe it also has a booth where people from different backgrounds and beliefs, labeling themselves as such, are available all day to answer random questions. And maybe this discussion is moderated by some kind of professional to make sure it doesn't get out of hand. Why does Ask Me Anything need to only be limited to Reddit? Also, so many of these brands have some serious prime real estate. What the are they doing with that real estate after hours? Literally nothing. So why don't you use your space to do more than just sell products? Once a quarter, maybe you can bring together thought leaders, influencers, academics of different backgrounds and perspectives together. You have cocktails, a DJ, food, and you sell products. I feel like over the years, we've done a pretty decent job at putting inclusivity on display. But now we need to work at giving it a voice. I'm not sure what that will look like. It will require us to come together, brainstorm, and come up with solutions that can be executed successfully. Thank you very much for listening to me today. I very much appreciate your time and attention. I hope you will consider my perspective, and I hope you will include your own. The future can be bright, but we can't get complacent in our gains and fool ourselves into thinking we've made gains we haven't yet. We need to stay realistic about just how much work and the kind of uncomfortable work we'll have to put in to truly get there, to that idea of inclusivity. Best wishes and kind regards, your internet friend, Anne Darla.
Do like this. Why not do like this?
Oh, because this one's a movie.